It's a great honour and personally rather moving to be asked back to this event 30 years after I founded Tavistock Consulting and where I was director for 5 years. And my warm thanks to Charlotte, the current director, for inviting me. She suggested that I speak about the origins of Tavistock Consulting, why I decided to set up the service, something of its history, and what did we actually do when we first started out. So I shall say some words about each of these. We worked both with commercial and public sector clients, but given the topic of this conference, I shall be focusing primarily on the public sector work that we did. So why did I set up Tavistock Consulting? The simplest answer is because I could see an opportunity, and we're talking here the early 1990s, and a gap in the market. Coaching for chief executives and senior leaders was a new and developing field in the United States, and some of these ideas were crossing the Atlantic. I was aware of one organization that had recently been set up to provide executive coaching to the commercial sector, but so far nothing in the public sector. I thought coaching would probably become a significant element in the field of organizational learning and development, but nothing like the vast industry that it has turned into. By some estimates, organizations around the world spend upwards of $7 billion annually on coaching. A second factor was the context. John Major had succeeded Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister, and the NHS had been experimenting with income generation. So the idea of a fee-paying service based at the Tavistock Clinic seemed feasible. And the third reason was my particular interest in the topic of what I shall refer to as emotional intelligence. Whilst I was chair of the adult psychotherapy department, we had been trialling psychotherapy for people with learning disabilities. And I was particularly struck by one patient of mine who told me about a birthday party that she'd attended where somebody had come in disguise and nobody else but she could work out that it was her uncle. It struck me that whilst her cognitive intelligence might be limited, her emotional intelligence was in many ways intact. At the same time, and for a number of years, I had been working as a psychologist advisor to the graduate recruitment scheme of a large multinational corporation, where it struck me that the senior executives who were making the selection decisions, whilst clearly cognitively highly intelligent, were often much weaker in emotional intelligence. By which I'm meaning both an awareness of one's own emotions, their impact on one's thinking and behaviour, and also an awareness of the emotions of others and their significance for them. A few years after we set up Tavistock Consulting, Daniel Goleman published his book Emotional Intelligence, which led to the popularisation of this topic and gave a certain credibility to an area which in those days, though not now of course, was viewed with considerable suspicion, or less so now. It seemed to me that a service that offered to develop emotional intelligence in senior executives and managers, both about themselves and others and the organisations in which they worked, and about the groups in which they worked, might be commercially viable. So I took some of these ideas to Anton Obholzer, who's here today, then Chief Executive of the Trust, and happily he agreed and supported the enterprise from the very beginning. I invited two colleagues, Claire Huffington and David Armstrong, who you met in those videos, both of whom were also psychologists, to join me. Claire was a family therapist with an understanding of the family as a system of interconnected and interdependent individuals and relationships, an approach she'd also been applying with colleagues to organisations. David brought the tradition of system psychodynamics thinking that had been developed at the Tavistock Institute and the technique of organisational role analysis that had been further developed at the Grubb Institute, where he was working at the time. In essence, this is a framework for thinking about organisational life that focuses on the interplay between psychological factors and systemic structures within an organisation, both conscious and unconscious. Organisations are not just rational structures, but also emotional places, where unconscious processes can significantly impact decision-making, leadership, and large and small group behaviour. My own background was primarily in individual psychotherapy, with a particular interest in the psychology, personality and character of the leader, and the way this influenced the psychology of the organisation, decision-making, the dynamics of power in organisations, and the relationship between leaders and followers. Together, Claire, David and I, with our different but complementary perspectives, and we had many overlapping interests, evolved the aim of the service as the provision of, as we put it, psychological consultancy to the emotional life of organisations, particularly with reference to factors that might be working unconsciously, what we called below the surface, which became our strapline. So what of its rich history? Since not all of you will know the history of the origins of the Tavistock Clinic, I will briefly mention that it was set up in 1920 as one of the first psychotherapy clinics in the UK, where the clinical staff largely gave their time without charge. The aim of psychotherapy, both individual and group, could be described as including the development of what I'm calling, for current purposes, an individual's emotional intelligence, a deeper awareness of their own emotional life and its impact on their behaviour and relationships, and how the emotions of others affect them. John Bowlby, who worked for many years at the Tavistock Clinic, and as you will probably know, developed the understanding of the importance of the development of stable attachments in babies and small children. In this context, he was a pioneer in persuading paediatricians to allow a parent to stay with their hospitalised child overnight. Up until that point, nurses and doctors tended to make the assumption that the fact that the child was distressed at first when their parents left, but generally quietened down, as a sign that they had adapted well. Bowlby and colleagues demonstrated that this quietness was a kind of giving up reaction rather than any sort of contentment. An example of how an organisation can be in denial of its impacts. He was also a pioneer of family therapy, or family discussions as he called them, to enable a family to gain a better understanding of their relationships and how symptoms expressed by a child might be a consequence, for example, of unexpressed conflict between the parents, ideas that might be commonplace now, but certainly weren't then. Again, one might say developing the emotional intelligence of the family members, their awareness of each other and how each other feels. The repetition and playing out of family dynamics, as well as the nature of patterns of attachment between followers and leaders, are both important elements in understanding a particular organisational culture, and for distinguishing leadership styles of different leaders and their effects. A second important figure at the Tavistock Clinic that I want to mention is Michael Barlind, a psychoanalyst who had escaped from Hungary in the late 1930s and who in the 1950s was a pioneer in developing methods for enhancing what I'm calling emotional intelligence. He wouldn't have used that term. But this time, not in patients or clients, but in professionals, and in particular general practitioners, who he invited to work together in small groups to better understand neither their patient nor the doctor, but the relationship between the doctor and a patient about whom the doctor was particularly concerned, and how understanding this relationship better might be a source of intelligence about how to best help the patient. This emphasis on the understanding of relationships is a quintessential feature of the Tavistock approach. This work still continues today, or as you may know it, by a related approach called the Schwartz rounds. The idea being that it is important for health professionals, indeed all those in helping professions, to reflect on their emotional reactions and responses towards those for whom they are caring. Three aspects of these emotional reactions are worth considering. Firstly, any caring relationship inevitably stirs up a mixture of both positive and negative feeling, with which the carer may feel uncomfortable and wish to deny. Secondly, being in contact with disturbed, damaged, and sometimes dying patients is inherently stressful and can have toxic consequences. And thirdly, patients don't always behave the way one would like them to, becoming a cause of frustration and a focus of unconscious anger. Unless staff have the opportunity to reflect on these experiences and learn from them, they may act out their feelings of frustration and a focus of unconscious, the patient becomes a focus of unconscious anger. Unless staff have the opportunity to reflect on these experiences and learn from them, they may act out their feelings of frustration in their attitude and behaviour towards the patient. Those in stressful professions, and here we could also include police, probation, social work, amongst others, need the opportunity to detox themselves from the imported toxicity of contact with difficult and sometimes dangerous people's with contact with sometimes dangerous people entails, if they are not to be negatively affected in some way through this contact. Charlotte will be speaking later about the importance of providing reflective spaces for staff to digest and metabolize difficult experiences. Likewise, leaders and managers can have distinctly mixed feelings about those they lead or manage, and certainly are on the receiving end of sometimes extreme feelings of love and hate. The method that Michael Bartlett developed with general practitioners was expanded from the 1960s onwards as a methodology at the Tavistock Clinic called work discussion groups for a wide range of professionals, from teachers to social workers, psychologists, clergy and police officers, amongst others. Here again were methods to increase the emotional intelligence of workers on the front line, both their emotional intelligence about themselves, their clients, the groups in which they worked, the institutions in which they were employed. To illustrate with a brief example, when working with the staff of an inpatient psychiatric facility in the weekly work discussion group, topic arose of whether or not patients should be permitted access to an electric kettle. Some of the staff thought this was essential as part of providing as normal an environment as possible, whilst others were equally vociferous that a kettle of boiling water was extremely dangerous. As I listened to the discussion, I was struck by its circular quality, and though I thought it might be a discussion also about something else, something that we at Tavistock Consulting would say was working below the surface of the discussion. And it seemed to me that whilst what was below the surface was a good deal of shared frustration amongst all staff with patients who were hard to help, that the fear of a patient being scalded with boiling water was partly an expression of unconscious anger with their frustrating patients. This is a simple example of a systems way of understanding a presenting situation. What appears to be a debate about access to a kettle was at the same time an expression of general frustration, about which, if you will pardon the pun, the staff needed to let off steam. The story of the kettle was of factors operating below the surface in a group. Related processes can also be found in very large systems, such as the NHS, which has a variety of purposes which can come into conflict with one another. At the overt public level, it is a health service aimed to bring patients back to a state of health. But at a second level below this, and vital to many of those who work there, it is also a political project of providing health care of equal quality independent of personal wealth. And it can also be said to have a third level, but below the surface purpose of supporting, as Anton has described, an unconscious fantasy or wish of preserving one from death. Formulated in this way, sheds light on why it is sometimes so complex and difficult to make change in the NHS, because why would you meddle with something that is there, something like a magic bracelet to keep away death? Organisational performance is what an enterprise delivers to its stakeholders. Organisational health is the ability of an organisation to align, execute and renew itself. A focus on performance without attention to health leads to high levels of stress, burnout and staff attrition. Sustainable organisational performance depends on organisational health. One critical problem facing health organisations is that it seems counterintuitive to focus on their own health. After all, they're supposed to be the healthy ones, focused on the illness of the patients. A more unconscious factor is that many of those drawn to the helping professions are much better at helping others than they are at looking after themselves, the so-called heroic helper or wounded healer syndromes. Interventions that can improve organisational health can be quite simple, such as regularly reviewing how we're working together, how people are feeling about their work, but finding space and time for such reflection to provide a context for creating what these days might be called psychological safety for staff, despite its obvious benefits, is hard in a resource-constrained environment, and more especially where there is unconscious resistance to becoming aware of one's own vulnerability. So in simple terms, Tavistock Consulting was set up to provide consultancy to the emotional life of organisations, just in the same way that individual psychotherapy, group psychotherapy and family therapy could be said to be methods of developing what I'm calling emotional intelligence. We offered three broad types of service: a form of executive coaching, which we called organisational role consultancy, based on the organisational role analysis method developed at the Grubb Institute, with the emphasis not so much on the personal qualities of the executive, but equally importantly on the way in which they were taking up their role in the organisation, how they were exercising authority and developing others. We also offered training in understanding group psychology and in basic coaching skills for managers, and this was an area that Claire Huffington took charge of. And finally, bespoke workshops to help executives think through strategic and operational questions, which was headed up by David Armstrong. The approach to consulting that we took was to enable learning from experience by helping individuals experience their experience and explore its significance, getting to know themselves better, as the psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion describes as one purpose of psychotherapy, getting to know oneself. As a consequence, we were often in a better position to devise appropriate approaches. They were often in a better position to devise appropriate approaches to current challenges, rather than self-styled experts coming in from outside and training them. We aim to enable individuals to find the confidence to work at the meaning of their experiences and translate them into appropriate and creative judgment, decision, and action. Although there are similarities with psychotherapy, it is fundamentally different in three respects. It does not start from the perspective of pathology, but rather from that of a challenge and what might be the solution. Where are we now, and what should we do next? And thirdly, it understands feelings and behaviours not so much as a property of the individual, but more as an aspect of the wider system that was finding expression at the individual level. A shared collective feeling being expressed through and by a particular individual in the system. Developing the emotional intelligence or awareness of leaders, of management teams, and even of whole organisations, we believed, would not lead only to better mental health, but also to greater creativity and insight into opportunities that the organisation might be missing. In the early 1990s, the emotional life of organisations was generally viewed as a negative: stress, conflict, misunderstanding, and so forth. We took the view that emotions could be, as David Armstrong has described, a source of intelligence, creativity, and energy. By dealing with unconscious aspects which individuals or groups had lost contact with, and in psychological parlance had projected, we took the view that if they could be reintegrated back, they might stimulate new thinking and different ways of feeling. I have concentrated in what I've been saying on the NHS and public sector organisations. In fact, a large section of our clients came from the commercial sector. However, describing that work would be less relevant for today's purposes, and in any case, the principles were generally the same. You may feel that what I've been saying is so obvious that it hardly needs saying. Well, it might be obvious, but that doesn't make it easy to do. A lot of what needs doing may indeed be obvious or simple, but hard and sometimes emotionally challenging to work at. The essence of this approach is simple, at least to describe: listening attentively, reflecting back what has been said, to enable a client, whether an individual, a group, or an organisation, to hear what they have said, and to reflect on what has emerged, and when appropriate and useful, drawing their attention to factors that they are less conscious or aware of. And finally, but sparingly, providing a framework of cognitive understanding to place that experience within. These are the elements, now well documented, of any effective helping relationship. Leadership and management are also, in part, helping relationships. Helping leaders and managers understand the emotional impact on them of their task, of the work of the organisation, of their impact on others, and of the demands and needs of those whom they manage, increases the emotional intelligence of an organisation. The task is to enable the client, again, whether an individual, a team, or an organisation, to have time and space to experience their experiences, so that these can be put into words, become conscious, and be available for reflection and thought, to understand both emotionally and cognitively, and then to ask what could be learned from this experience to deal with current circumstances, what is going on now. It is sometimes rather portentously said that leadership is a journey, and that the consultant's task is to help the leader on their journey. I think we might rather say that the consultant's task is to help a leader to stay afloat, whilst also being aware of what may lie below the surface. Thank you.